Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Raihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined by my distinguished colleague and friend, Chris Rufo, author of America's Cultural Revolution, which is now, I'm very happy to report, a New York Times bestseller. I first met Chris in Seattle in 2015. At the time, he was already an accomplished documentary filmmaker, and I was struck by his humility, intellectual curiosity, and civic devotion. Even then, Chris was attuned to the human cost of rising homelessness in his adopted hometown and the despair he'd seen in the nation's poor urban neighborhoods. He also recognized that something was badly broken in our culture. And as successful as he already was, Chris wanted to do more. He wanted to help change the direction of the country he loved. In the years since, Chris has worked tirelessly to do just that. Through his reporting for City Journal, he shed light on how schools, government bureaucracies, and major corporations have leveraged their power and prestige to advance radical and deeply divisive, deeply corrosive ideas, often under the guise of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In doing so, Chris has had an enormous impact on American public life, inspiring citizen activists across the country to make their voices heard, to proudly assert their values, and to revitalize and build new institutions. That intellectual spadework has now culminated in his brilliant new book. In a moment, I'll talk to Chris about why he wrote this important book and what he learned while writing it. But first, I want to say a brief word of thanks to our many friends and supporters here in the room. First, I'm proud to say that we have two of our trustees with us tonight, Ann Charters and Ravenel Curry. Thank you very much for all you do for us. We also have our former president, Larry Mohn, who did so much to build the Manhattan Institute. So thank you to Larry as well. To those of you who are new to City Journal and the Manhattan Institute, we are an organization that works to keep America and its great cities prosperous, safe, and free. To that end, we recruit and support fearless and tenacious scholars like Chris that challenge the ideologues who dominate so many of our nation's leading institutions. We do everything in our power to ensure their voices are heard, even when powerful people endeavor to shut them up or shout them down. We cannot do this work without you, and we are immensely grateful to all of you for your friendship and support. So, thanks to all of you, and now we'll get into some questions. Chris, let's start at the beginning. What first got you interested in the way that left-wing ideology has spread in American institutions?
I think just from my own observations, I was living in the city of Seattle, and it was a beautiful place to live, a thriving city, had a growing economy, lots of opportunity. And then over the period of a few years, my wife and I and our oldest son and then our second son just watched everything fall apart around us. And it wasn't the case of a dying steel mill town that had lost its main economic support, but it actually was this paradox that the quality of life was collapsing amid rising prosperity. And we had all of a sudden tents lining our streets. We had needles on the ground. We had screaming people sometimes we had to shield our kids from on the streets, people injecting drugs openly and brazenly, robbing the stores. We had one incident where one man had doused another man with lighter fluid and lit him on fire just down the street from our home. And so I had a question. So, well, why is this? And so that's actually what connected me to City Journal. I wrote a piece at the encouragement of a mentor of mine in Seattle, and I sent it around and then reconnected with you. And I said, I don't know what to do with this. I'm not a journalist. I just have written this piece. Give me some advice. And so he said, well, this looks great. We'll publish it at the magazine. And so that was the beginning of working together. And I guess before we get too much in the conversation, I'd also like to make some thank yous. First and foremost to Raihan, who not only got me really started on all of this, supported the journalism I was doing in an early stage, but as the drama and the provocations and the risks and dangers were rapidly increasing as I started reporting on critical race theory, he was calm cool, collected, measured, and rock solid the whole time. And I'll tell you, I had a number of people that were very scared during that big and very public fight on critical race theory. And Raihan and the whole editorial team were not among them. I mean, really stick to the facts, do good work, make the best arguments, and felt confident that we prevail. Brian is gone. Brian has informed me, editor of City Journal, has taken his first vacation in many years. So sad that he's not able to make it, but he deserves immense thanks for what he's done shepherding this magazine, which is really the highest quality conservative journalism, analysis, and opinion in the United States. Paul is here, Paul Beston. I don't know, can't see him, but if you raise your hand, or there he is in the back. He's the editor that I work with the most, and I'd just like to thank Paul for his patience and for always dialing down the rhetoric in my pieces. I'm very excitable, and I just want to get in the fight and really throttle people. And then Paul is the very calm. He says, "Yes, Chris, we got to reduce the martial metaphors. We have to dial it down. This is for City Journal. You could throw the hand grenades on Twitter." So that has actually been quite good. And every time I look at the pieces that I send to Paul and they come back, the prose is always tight, very highbrow, always much more articulate than the slop that I send him. And then of course Alana, is Alana here today? I didn't see her. Maybe. Alana also, just like to thank her, even though she's not here, for all of her kind of leadership and support. And then I guess the HarperCollins team, Eric Nelson is here, my editor. Eric Nelson has 3 books on the New York Times bestseller list right now. And so, I mean, he really is the premier publisher of thoughtful conservative books, and so it's an honor to work with him. My agent, Jonathan Brunitsky, is here, flew up from Florida with his wife. Just amazing. Jonathan was working everything from lining up the deals and running the auction, getting many publishers excited, and then helping me deliver a great book, providing feedback. And then today's, call this last week, hey, which holes do you have in the PR? Let's make sure we get everything. So did a phenomenal job. Bernadette Certain, I think, is here. I saw her earlier. At MI, she was the Sherpa of the book and mostly provided good psychological support at the beginning. Felt a lot of pressure at the beginning. I've never written a book. I kind of out of my depths here, and she's kind of helped me. All right, calm down, one step at a time. This is how you do it. So that was really essential at the beginning. Of course, Teresa helped on the PR. And then on my team, Armin, who works closely with me, did an incredible job on the PR for this book. So I wanted to say thank to him as well.
No. Chris, one thing I'll just note is that I'm very struck by the fact that you are now seen as the ultimate provocateur, culture warrior. But I remember a different Chris. I remember a Chris who was, just a very gentle, mild-mannered, good dude who was really someone, you thought of yourself as a broadly conservative, but a moderate conservative, and someone who was always in very liberal milieus. Like growing up in the Sacramento suburbs, going to Georgetown, being a filmmaker, you were not trying to stand out or go out of your way to provoke people. And yet here you are, someone who decided at some point that actually if you want to change the conversation, sometimes you do need to be aggressive and sharp. Sometimes you need to ruffle feathers. I'm curious about that insight or how that changed. So you described how you were watching Seattle fall apart around you. I think that's not something that's really in dispute. It's not just you who saw that. A lot of folks saw that. But for whatever reason, you decided to do something about it that was fundamentally quite difficult for someone who is a friendly, good-natured person, right? So, I mean, what was the twist? What was the change?
I think experience, and then trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And I got a very quick political education in the city of Seattle. I went into it kind of naive and open-eyed and had this idea that everything is decided by a fair and open debate, and there's an exchange of ideas, and then the public sorts out the best ideas, and those are the ideas that win and change policy. And then that idea, that expectation made contact with reality and was immediately shattered into a million pieces. And I discovered that that the actual politics operates on a very different set of rules than it seems, and maybe than we would like in an ideal world. And so I had some early and very public and very humbling defeats against some of the journalism I was doing. I briefly ran for city council in the city of Seattle. I mean, just the total blind naivete. But what happened with that experience of getting really just rocked by the city's media, NGOs, governing officials,
And you had people
street
threatening-
activists.
I mean, you had people who were threatening you and your family at that point.
That's right. Yeah, and we had some pretty, kind of risks to our personal safety. Posters with my face on it around where my kids were going to school. I mean, it got very dirty, it got very rough and tumble, and it got very frightening very quickly. And so, licking my wounds from that process, I like to say all of the success that I've been able to achieve since then was all learned in maybe 6 weeks in that initial process. And so, that humbling experience, that feeling of failure, that feeling of fear, changed the way that I think about politics. And I think I'm here, you're all friends, probably most of you, maybe some enemies, I don't know. But I still am that amiable, fun, relaxed person. But I also have a kind of, you go into the changing room, you put on the other outfit, and I will punch you straight in the face over and over and over, rhetorically speaking, metaphorically speaking. Because look, it is a rough and tumble game. And I think I learned that in order for your ideas to, I measure my success on, do the ideas and arguments that I'm making influence public opinion and become public policy? Do they change the law? Do they change how things are governed? Do they improve society in the way that I believe that it should be improved? And so in order to do that, I think it requires a certain level of toughness, aggression, desire for conflict, and then it requires a cunning, a sophistication, verbal capacities, and so I've just really focused on trying to learn those inner principles of how things actually work, and then applying them as deeply and quickly as possible. And so that's been a secondary education to all of those formal qualities that you learn about journalism, politics, and policy.
So you began on this journey by doing really just a basic look at the brokenness of certain public systems. You get this intense, ferocious blowback, and then you start looking into things that school children and corporate employers are being taught. Why did you think it was important to learn about the genealogy of those ideas? What got you interested in the history of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a process of discovery going backwards. And so I'm always looking for new stories, and having learned the ropes in media, figuring out which stories connect with the public, which stories gain an audience, which stories drive conversation, and really kind of loving that. And I think the New York Post is a great example. Those salacious headlines. I eat that stuff up. I love it. It's a lot of fun to tell those kind of stories. And so I started getting these tips in 2020 after the kind of George Floyd eruption of all these people in different institutions that were undergoing these really, kind of vaguely Maoist diversity training seminars, white privilege seminars, kind of racial scapegoating. I mean, some of the stuff was truly outrageous. And so my initial instinct was just, hey, this is a kind of hot story, a salacious story, something I'd never heard of. Let's put something in City Journal. And it was totally off of my beat of working on urban dysfunction, but I could tell it was an interesting story. And those stories just exploded. I mean, really, you sit at your, I live in Washington State, so I can't get any real human feedback in that way from the media. So I'm just looking at my computer and thinking, wow, this is quite interesting. These stories are really,
there was steam coming off
people's attention. Yeah, there's my computer is melting. I mean, it was great. And so I said, all right, well, this is quite interesting. And I thought it was maybe a one and done, and then go back. And then I started getting tips after tip after tip after tip. And over the course of this run of reporting, I developed about 5,000 different sources around the country, 5,000 people contacting me with this information. And then I knew this is a big story. It's an untold story. It's a fresh angle on things. And then I started getting documents from K through 12 schools. And as I was doing the reporting, I was very curious. Well, why, all of a sudden, I think in 2020, many of us felt that all of a sudden, all of our elite institutions and then trickling down to kind of everyday institutions were suddenly in an ideological fervor along some very specific concepts, whether it was race or then gender, and they were in kind of total unison in this organic and for the time inexplicable way. Well, why is it that the Fortune 100 companies, the K through 12 schools, the kind of university bureaucracies are all suddenly driving the same ideology through our national life? And so as I was doing the reporting, which was the fun, active work, the volley, the sparring, the screaming and the shouting on Fox News, I was also doing the kind of silent work, total invisible work that I didn't even tell anyone about, except for Jonathan and Eric, of actually going backwards into the archives and uncovering where do these ideas come from, how did they achieve power, and why all of a sudden do they seem so dominant in American life. And so those questions were the deeper questions and the scholarly questions that I sought to answer and then ended up becoming this book.
Your narrative starts with Herbert Marcuse and the radicals who he inspired. Can you tell us a bit about Marcuse's belief system, his framework, and why did it prove so compelling and so inspiring to so many?
I mean, and this is one thing that I try to do in the book is there's a specific genre of conservative book that, in my view, hey, my baby's here, little baby, but sometimes you get conservative books and the author has a kind of sneering tone, looks down, and the idea is basically look at these deranged campus lunatics. Their ideas are awful and terrible and preposterous and isn't it a very bad thing that they are achieving success with them? And I think that's just a very narrow way to look at it. And so I took very seriously what is captivating and fascinating and inspiring about this set of ideas. How can I understand these figures from the 1968 student revolution and then kind of racial revolution? First, understand them on their own terms, as they would understand themselves. Then understand them to try to figure out what makes their philosophy or activism so compelling, and only then layer in the criticism. And Marcuse, for all of his faults, you can't help but read him and recognize his moments of brilliance, his perceptiveness in American life and institutional life. And there is a streak of idealism that is still somewhat inspiring to read today. You get a sense of someone that is very much committed to his philosophy, to his beliefs, to his principles, was willing to take risks to advance them in his own life, and then had a genuine political commitment. And so you understand that, and then you say, okay, well, what were the ideas? Where were their flaws? Why did it lead to disaster, not only in his own time, but also in our time? But I think that you really have to understand people first and foremost, why these ideas succeed, because if you were simply to say, hey, these ideas are bad and they've taken over our national life, but you don't seek to actually understand the means through which they've achieved those victories, I think that you're going to be ill-equipped for defeating them.
What is one of those ideas that really captured your attention? And, curious.
Yeah, I mean, Marcuse captured a disillusionment with the society of mass affluence. And I think all of us here, the Manhattan Institute, we understand the role of the free market. We understand that it creates prosperity. But I think he identified for his two-part coalition. He believed that the new revolutionary subject was no longer the Marxist working class that had become anti-revolutionary. His idea was that the working class American who had, a large house, a car, a picket fence, 2 kids, a stable job, was anti-revolutionary. And he believed that the revolution would occur through a coalition of the white student radicals in the universities and the black, what Eldridge Cooper called lumpen proletariat, the most disaffected black populations in inner cities. And he said this synthesis of kind of high-low coalition could drive the revolution. And I think for those, especially for those kind of white college-educated radicals at the time, I think he spoke to a sense of their own alienation, their own anxieties, their own dissatisfaction, and you can understand how they gravitated towards him because he also speaks the language of Hegel and Kant, and even though English was his second language, he was an emigre, just speaks in this great accent, and it's all very exciting. I imagine it was very exciting for the ones listening. And then you see the outcome of these ideas. It's an absolute disaster. But there is still a strain of the utopian that I think that he strives to lay out for his followers. And I think that he really believed in a deep way that all of this tremendous intellectual ferment from Hegel and through Marx and through the current period would create greater human happiness. And for me, he's ultimately a tragic figure because his utopian idealistic vision was taken by these radical movements. It had these fatal human flaws and led to violence. It led to death. It led to destruction. It led to nihilism. And so all of the stories that I tell in the book are ones of idealism disintegrating into nihilism. But to me, that idealistic current is still why people, kind of fall for these ideas over and over, even though they've been discredited by historical experience, for 100+ years.
So you describe how there really was a kind of leftist militancy. There was a commitment to violent revolution. There really was a belief that this Marcusian coalition could actually overthrow the American regime. But then eventually people saw, wait, that didn't work. And so there was this kind of pivot to a new approach, one that you describe in detail in the book, when, violent leftist revolution, that promise fails. And then activists decided they'd be more effective taking over institutions from the inside. Can you tell us a bit about Paulo Freire, how he viewed the role of educators and how his disciples wound up shaping American public education, American education writ large?
Yeah, that's really the heart of the story in the book. It's this turn from the idea that you could have a radical Marxist-Leninist armed revolution against the United States. And it sounds totally preposterous to us today, but if you go back and you read their correspondence, their pamphlets, their propaganda literature, they had a theory, kind of a well-articulated theory of how they would spark wide-scale revolt against the United States government. And they even developed these really outlandish plans for what they would do once they achieved it. And when that crashed and burned, in 1968, you have the election of Richard Nixon. In 1972, you have Nixon's 49-state landslide. You have J. Edgar Hoover, although always sometimes a little bit dubiously, had really decapitated those radical organizations. The movement was finished, and they acknowledged it themselves. They had a kind of desperation move, a switch in strategy to what they called the Long March through the institutions, which is, of course, an allusion to Chairman Mao's Long March during the Chinese Civil War. And so their concept was to abandon the desire to achieve dominance over the means of industrial production, taking over factories or taking over the Ford plant, and kind of abandoning the desire to rule over the means of rule, means of law, the government. And they said, what we have to do from this point of necessity is burrow into the existing cultural institutions, beginning with the universities, in the media, in K-12 schools, in what we now think of as NGOs, and we'll take our ideology from the outside and go around any kind of democratic consent. They viewed themselves explicitly as an extra-parliamentary campaign to bring their ideas in through these vulnerable spots within the institutions, and then use these tactics that they learned on the streets and in the trenches and robbing banks and, planting bombs in the U.S. Capitol, to play hard-knuckled politics in the faculty lounge, in the teachers' union hall, in the kind of, now we think of it as the DEI bureaucracy.
And their rivals didn't even know to expect this. They were, they didn't have a clear sense of what was going on, so they were outmaneuvered.
They were outmaneuvered entirely. And you imagine the kind of, good old-fashioned small L liberals operating on the good principles of free exchange of ideas within a faculty lounge. But you have a guy that's just come in from, kind of the training of the radicals. He's going to mow you over every time. I mean, they had no capacity to resist this. And because it was always coming from the left, it was even more difficult for them to resist it on principle and then also on pragmatic grounds. And so this was a campaign that they outlined in their own writing over the time. And they really and truly, over the process of decades, they built it. They had kind of targets. They said, we need to have 100 Marxist professors of education, and then we need to go from that first 100 to taking over the graduate schools of education that train K through 12 teachers. And, they did it. They had a plan, they executed the plan, and they achieved their goals.
So the idea is that you use the framework of academic free speech, open intellectual inquiry, you then dominate, you then reproduce yourself and your movement, and then suddenly it becomes effectively coercive. You effectively dominate it, and you kind of change the norm once you've gotten in there.
And then on top of that, then you use the appeal to those same principles to defend yourself against any even democratic kind of regulation or restraint. And so you have these amazing college departments and universities, and sometimes they're 10 to 1, 50 to 1, 100 to 1. And in the case of interdisciplinary studies, so kind of race and gender studies loosely, there are certain departments that are 126 to 0 in the academic kind of surveys. It's like, well, wait a minute. If you have 126 people on the far left and 0 people on the center or the right, and then you're saying, well, any regulation of this, any incursion on this, any disruption of this state of affairs is a threat to free speech and academic freedom. You say, wait a minute, is it really, can you really appeal to these principles when the substantive status quo is one of total domination by one political faction over the other? And I think the answer is obviously no. That there's no free exchange of ideas because there's no exchange of ideas in the first place. It merely becomes this circular and cyclical repetition. And then you see the quality of the scholarship just tank, just go through the floor. And so that's the environment that we are up against. That's the environment that the book seeks to explain, and also then to start rallying the cry to start to change. Because I have to imagine, and maybe this is kind of the naive part resurfacing, but I have to imagine that even for the people within these institutions that are good, good center left or good even kind of good smaller liberals, I have to imagine that when they're really honest with themselves, that this is not an ideal state of affairs. To have a deadening orthodoxy, to have low-quality scholarship, to have no exciting debate or contention or conflict even, I have to think that there is even a restlessness or a desire for change, even among people who would not traditionally be allied with me. And I think that actually is happening right now. I think even the last week, we're seeing the things shift. I'm starting to see the hard left people squeal a little bit. Nothing I like to see more than that. And I think that, look, my ambition in the near term and the medium term is to really drive a knife through the far left and the kind of reasonable or rational left, and try to create some rhetorical maneuvers, some reporting, certainly the argument in the book, to really maybe even restore back to the center some of those institutions that, whether we like it or not, really still do matter. And one of the things that was fascinating to me in the book is that, and I think this is really appropriate today, because yesterday the book was on the New York Times list. Today I had an op-ed in the New York Times, which really drove a lot of excitement today. they're calling for my imprisonment for this for some reason, and then execute. Some people are calling for my execution, which I felt was maybe a tad excessive. But actually, this is not a departure. And one of the things I learned in the 1960s and 70s, actually, the New York Times was no fan of these people. The New York Times wrote some brutal critiques of Marcuse. The New York Times just thrashed the Weather Underground, the kind of the kind of domestic terrorists of the time. And even into the 1980s, I mean, they really looked, the Times opinion pages and even the reported factual opinions. As I was doing the research for the book, I was chuckling to myself. I said, am I agreeing with the New York Times here? Am I a kind of Times, but you got the sense that there was still an establishment at that time that was policing its own side, that was trying to maintain standards, that had some self-confidence. And maybe I'm making this up, but my kind of image that I put in my head, I didn't write this because I couldn't substantiate it, but kind of the fantasy in my head was, these are the working class reporters that got in there. They were, drinking pails of gin and tonics at lunchtime, and they had no respect for these kind of Ivy League educated kids that were planting bombs in police stations. Because that was their brother, that was their cousin, that was the kid that grew up down the street from them. And so I think perhaps we are seeing a moment. I think we are, and I'm helping to try to drive this moment further, where things are shifted. And that doesn't mean that we have to be compromise our principles. But in fact, I think the reason this is happening is because some of us, many of us now, stood on principle. We made very pointed arguments. We never backed down, and we forced them to engage. We overcame their arguments, and now we're settling the new status quo. We're in a process of political negotiation. And so, in my point of view, this is the time where you have to be even tougher. And you have to negotiate from a position of strength. And I think that there is a cultural renegotiation happening. And my big campaign this year with Manhattan Institute was to really politicize and then cripple the DEI industry and abolish DEI bureaucracies in conservative states as far as our public university systems. We did 10 or 11 investigative reports exposing the DEI bureaucracy in public universities in Florida and Texas. The professors kind of thrashed and screamed and were generally very upset about it. But we hammered them with the evidence through public records requests. We really brought it up to a salient issue. We teamed up with some exciting people like the governor of Florida and legislators in Texas. And we got legislation passed through public policy advocacy in a nonpartisan sense, of course, abolishing the DEI departments in every public university in Florida and abolishing the DEI departments in every public university in Texas. This is great in itself because it's a waste of money, it stifles academic scholarship, and it promotes an orthodoxy that turns the university, which should be pursuing truth, into something that's pursuing partisan political objectives. But it also, in the minds of many people, creates a political issue out of it and gives even private companies all of a sudden the space that they need to start shedding some of these ideological programs within their ranks. And was very pleased to see that there's been a 75% reduction in searches in these big companies for these chief diversity roles. Companies across the country are shedding these departments as at a very fast clip. Even in companies that are kind of left-wing California tech companies, they're really slicing out these essentially commissar positions. Let's be honest about it. And so, in my view, this is a very exciting moment because we can seize the initiative, we can shape the debate, we can kind of break apart the coalition of the people that have been opposing what we're doing for the last couple of years. And I think we've done so in a way that is extremely rigorous, that is totally principled, and that occupies the really undeniable moral high ground. And so to me, this is a very exciting night, because this is a very exciting night. It's a culmination of a lot of work that we've done. And so I think, look, the fight is never over. Tomorrow we're going to be back to the trenches, but at least for a couple hours, I think that it's quite nice to celebrate all that we've done.
Chris, absolutely. Chris, you're one of the things you're very well known for is having elevated this idea of critical race theory, identifying it as a highly influential set of ideas, just tracing its origins and tracing its spread. And in the book, you offer a very sympathetic and humane portrait of Derek Bell, one of the legal academics who is well known for his role in kind of spreading these ideas, popularizing them. I want you to tell us a little bit about Bell, what you learned from him, and how it influenced how you think about CRT and why it's so powerful and influential.
Yeah, I mean, all four figures. You spend a year, kind of holed away in your office, living with these characters, these historical figures. Angela Davis still alive, so kind of a contemporary figure. I think that if you approach it with a bit of an open heart, you develop some sympathy for them. And Derek Bell is really, I think, a perfect illustration, and it's the last section in the book, of that same principle that starts with Marcuse, and it's really the same story with Derek Bell. Derek Bell was the descendant of black slaves in the Deep South. His parents moved to Pittsburgh to seek opportunity. He went to college, served in the Air Force, went to law school, was a brilliant student by all accounts. And then he got a job desegregating schools in the Deep South with the NAACP legal fund. And then I read his own accounts and then historical accounts of that time, and you get a sense of this really noble personality and really a brilliant man, a moral man, and a courageous man. I mean, he was going down at a time where it was very dangerous, even for those lawyers, to go down and work on these desegregation cases. He oversaw 300 cases. He talks about in his memoirs some of the people that he met that he was working with to defend and to assist. And in a way, what happened next in his life was just such a tragedy. He became totally disillusioned with that vision of colorblind equality. He became totally disillusioned with even the Brown versus Board decision, which of course desegregated the schools. And he became even disillusioned in the final phase of his career with the 14th Amendment, with Abraham Lincoln, with of course the Founding Fathers, and then developed this philosophy of racial pessimism that was so profound that by the end of his life it devolved into what can only be described as a paranoia. And he had this verbal tick. I listened to some of his interviews from that period, and he would say, well, I might be racially paranoid, or I might be paranoid, but... And I thought it was just such a sad thing to see that this idealism of that, treating everyone equally as individuals, fighting for people who have gone through real hardship and real discrimination under segregation at the time, and then fighting for that idea of equality. To then really just having a theory of ultimate and all-consuming nihilism. And of course, Derek Bell was famous briefly in 2012 because there was video of him at a speech Barack Obama was giving during one of Derek Bell's protests in the 90s. And so he was kind of a mentor loosely to Barack Obama. And after Barack Obama became president, his former student in some sense, not directly, but tangentially at Harvard Law. And he says something to the effect that, well, Barack Obama is just a black president of a white supremacist nation. And you got to think, what a sad statement, a really profoundly sad statement. And I think that Derek Bell's pessimism, towards the end, he said that we're on the verge of a genocide in the United States. And what was even sadder, actually, is the more pessimistic he became, the more nihilistic his work became, the more apocalyptic his fictional stories and his nonfiction writing became, the more he was rewarded by the left-wing establishment, by the universities, by the publishing houses, by NPR and other media. And so you have kind of this very twisted situation where you have, in the genesis of critical race theory,
he was giving them what they wanted. It's almost as though they wanted some kind of incredibly bleak, self-hating narrative, and he was somehow serving that. And so they've abandoned the pursuit of that ideal, which drove him personally at that time, and they've substituted it for these I think very narcissistic and very destructive status games,
It becomes a kind of empty pursuit. And so, to me, he's the ultimate tragic figure in this. And I think as what we're doing at Manhattan Institute and the policies that we worked on, I mean, we're putting forth a vision for colorblind equality. Treat everyone equally as an individual. You know, no punishment or reward for people. No reducing people to avatars of group identity. And I think that it's consistent with the principles of the Declaration and the 14th Amendment and the idealistic interpretation of the Civil Rights Act. And I think it's also supported by large majorities of the American public. And so to me, we have a great cause. And really, I think that there's a sense, even among the critical race theorists in this debate over the last 2 years, I think that they know that what they're doing is wrong. And I think that they know that what they're doing is maybe effective for their own careers, their own advancement. But I really feel a sense that even haunts their writing, that they're pushing this pseudo-radicalism that entrenches their own power within the institutions, but offers nothing for poor or struggling people of any racial background, and is really an empty ideology. It's an ideological husk that has been hollowed out over the years. And so I like to think, and certainly it would be very nice for this to be true, that what we're doing is an antidote to that. And where they have pessimism, we have optimism. Where they have cynicism, we have principle. And so that's why I think that even in the very turbulent and difficult debate that we've had over the years, even amidst really awful attacks on me, on us, on what we're doing, I think the public has seen that guiding light in what we're doing. And I think that's why we've been able to ultimately triumph.
Chris, I have one last question for you. Drawing on the lessons of these incredibly charismatic, energetic, incredibly influential, winsome thinkers, what are the lessons that the counter-revolutionaries can learn from the revolutionaries? You've been talking a bit about your method, your approach, where it comes from, but I wonder for all of us in this room, as we seek to effect change, as we seek to heal these institutions that are broken, what can we learn from the thinkers that you highlight in the book?
Well, I think this is something that has been somewhat disturbing to my critics on the left and somewhat disturbing to some of my critics on the right. And they say, well, Rufo has adopted the tactics of the left, fighting for the principles of the right. I say, okay, and what's the problem with that? And so in a sense, these stories, these people, these ideas, I try to, it's a kind of bizarre. It's like, well, if you can learn something useful or something that is valuable, why would you not use it? It's like you see a tool on the ground that you see a power drill and you have a construction project and you don't pick it up. And so I think that my own political practice, for lack of a better term, I have absolutely learned from some of these people, some of these thinkers, adopted some of their most effective tactics, while of course not the most extreme tactics or ones that would compromise my own principles. But I think that we live in an environment that they created through their ideologies, through their dominance over the discourse and opinion-shaping institutions. And so my view is that the only way out of that status quo is through the status quo. And so while I would love to, I would love for all of this to be settled in a very genial Oxford-style debate, I recognize that we have to fight the fight given the conditions that we see around us today. And so I'm fully convinced that we can adopt some of these tactics, we can internalize them into our own practice as they're useful, without compromising the values and principles that we're ultimately seeking to advance. But that actually, from a practical perspective, some of them are quite useful. And I found that this is actually also kind of fun because it flummoxes my opponents at every turn. They say, you can't do that, we do that. I say, well, how the tables have turned. And so for me, it's a pragmatic question, a political question. And would I love for society to move towards a position, towards a place where some of these tactics would become irrelevant or unnecessary, yeah, great. But until then, I console myself by saying, well, I'm happy to put my record against any of the records of my critics. And that actually seems to shut them up quite quickly. Because especially for some of my critics on the right, which have a sense that they're too good for what I do. They're kind of smug and superior, that they would never engage in the kind of political fight in the manner that I do. I think in every turn, I just kind of quietly to myself say, all right, well, let's see this person's record. Where have they influenced the public debate? Where have they driven meaningful change? How have they advanced their high-minded principles in the real world? And for some reason, I always feel better after I do that. And so I think that, look, this is a lot of fun. And at the end of the day, we started this conversation with an observation you had. It's like, oh, you're kind of amiable fellow. And then you turn into like I remember actually talking to Raihan and early in this fight, and he called me up and he said, hey, you're doing great. And it's like, you're such a nice guy. You're really easy to talk to. You're very chill. And then I go on Twitter, and it's like you have 2 submachine guns in your hands, and you're just mowing everyone down. I remember that conversation, and I said, yeah, that's how it's going to be for here moving forward. But at the end of the day, look, I don't have any enmity for people. I don't have any hatred for people. I don't have any enemies in a real sense. And I think that that's the essential thing, is to maintain your own idealism, to maintain your own principles, to have your own life and your own relationships sustain you through even some of the difficult times, and then ultimately to be a happy warrior, that kind of old image, and that's what I strive to do.
I remember one conversation we had ages ago in which we were just talking about how what you're up against is this strangely seductive, charismatic ideology that is telling people that the world is bleak, that you're inevitably a victim. And, you are being aggressive in advancing this idea that you can be powerful, that actually you can take control, that you can be a teacher, you can be a parent, you're worried about what's happening in your kids' schools, and actually you are powerful. There's something that you can do. And I think that idea is incredibly infectious, and you've done an enormous amount to advance it. Please join me in thanking Chris and congratulating him on his wonderful new book.